Hi, I'm Molly Barnes. Welcome to Art Inquiry. My guest today is Glen Ossiander, a wonderful painter. He started actually in advertising, and like a lot of others before him, Tom Christopher, John Register, two that come to mind immediately, he just got sick of it one day and became a fine artist, which was his first love. So without further ado, we'll find out how it all happened. Welcome.
Thanks, Molly. Nice to be here.
Tell me how you got started, Glen. When was your first inkling that you were an artist?
Well, I started drawing as a little kid, I guess like most artists do. And one memory that I have, very vivid memory, is copying a picture of Joseph Stalin from the local newspaper in Philadelphia.
Why Stalin? You just like the blacks and whites?
Well, he died.
Yeah.
And this was big news back in those days. And I remember this, it was this just very strong image, and I sat down with a pencil and paper and I copied it, and I remember it was just about exactly the same size as the paper, and it was a pretty good drawing. I can still see it in my mind, and I remember the reaction of my family, my grandmother, my uncles and cousins. Oh boy, this is so great. And that sort of just encouraged me and kept me going, and I always got a lot of very positive reinforcement for making art.
Were you the best in your class?
Usually, yeah, that would happen too. That was one of the other things that kind of reinforced the idea that this is something I should continue working on.
What was your family like?
Well, they were very supportive. It was a real working class neighborhood that I grew up in, and all of the people were either worked in factories, or in the case of some of the men, they worked in the shipping industry and merchant marines, in the Navy.
Was your father supportive of you?
Well, my father is a vague memory for me because he disappeared when I was 8 years old.
You're kidding, just walked out and never came back?
Exactly. And the worst part of that was that my mother, I was 8 years old as the oldest of 5 children. My youngest sister.
So you became the father?
Well, I don't really think of it like that, but because actually what happened was, it was so difficult for my mother supporting 5 kids that we were split up among the family for a time until she could kind of get us all back together, which she slowly did. You know, she got the babies back first, and then would get my 2 brothers back, and then eventually I came back to live with her. But
just reading now the Christopher Lawford book about losing his father, actually not being absent during most of his growing up, I realized how hard that must be. But did it, in a way, become a benefit in terms of helping you with your art?
I don't know if it helped me with my art, but I think it helped me become a pretty decent person as a man, because I saw other men around me, again, uncles, grandparents, cousins, who were pretty good people, you know, and who stuck through all of the trials and tribulations that came up in their families, and those became my role models. My father was just missing, and so he became a smaller and smaller factor in the whole picture.
Were there people?
Caused a lot of problems, of course, because there was a lot of pressure to just try to get through it all, but that was not the major factor.
What's the name of the woman that's written the book on right side, right brain, left brain?
Oh, Betty Edwards. I learned when I came out here that she lives in Santa Monica, or did at the time, and she's a school teacher who wrote a book called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, and has a very interesting theory about how people become artists and how actually almost any of us could really learn to draw, even those people who like to say, I can't draw a straight line. It's a theory that's based on the idea simply that at some point, because of the way our culture, what our culture puts emphasis on, that we put art and learning to draw aside for all of the other things that the school systems tend to put the emphasis on. And therefore, most of us stop learning about art when we're about 9 years old or 10 years old or so. When you look at the work of adults who haven't had any art lessons, they all seem to have stopped around that same place. And the rest of us who become artists are simply those people who just kept going, you know. It's a very interesting book. I think it's in some ways, one of the best books ever written about art because it removes a lot of the mystique. A lot of people think that art, being an artist, is sort of some sort of a gift from someplace. She doesn't hold to that, and I sort of go along with that. I think it's something lots of people really have in them. They are just, they've just forgotten how to see.
Who are some of your favorite artists?
Well, I've always been drawn to the abstract pictures because that was sort of a big thing.
That was my
happening.
period. I grew up in the abstract-expressionist, de Kooning. Pollock died the year before I got into that milieu, but Joan Mitchell was my next-door neighbor and my best friend.
You were right there with them.
Yeah.
I was an adolescent at that point, you know, and a teenager in Philadelphia, and but even as that, I was aware of how powerful a force that was. I mean, here were these guys in New York City who literally wrenched the center of art from Paris.
The Surrealists in Paris,
from Paris, and moved it to New York City almost overnight. And I remember that big article in Life magazine with a picture of Jackson Pollock saying, "Is this the best painter alive?" Or
Jack the Dripper. That was the first thing I
Jack
saw
the
about
Dripper.
contemporary art, and I thought this is going to be my life's work. It was just such a revelation.
Yeah. Well, it made a big impression on me too, and I continue to always be impressed by what the abstract painters were doing. But you know, I like lots of realist painters as well, and current painters in a more realistic mode are Lucian Freud. I think is a fabulous painter. I like Odd Nerdrum's paintings. Among the still living abstract or non-objective painters, I would include Robert Rauschenberg as a major influence on me. But
he used to come out and visit Joan Mitchell with Jasper Johns, and they would sit on the beach and gossip about the artists, and they didn't pay any attention to me. I was listening, but they said, we're going to take over the art scene. And there's always that father-son thing where each movement in art tries to replace or take over what's existed before.
I envy your experiences of actually being around those people. I've only met a very few of them. But you know, they certainly had a dramatic influence on my life. And Joan Mitchell is one of my favorite painters, as is Helen Frankenthaler, who is an artist I met, and you're very taken with her. She's of course highly regarded, but I think what some people forget is she was one of the first. She was actually the first person to ever lay the canvas on the floor and just kind of let the paint flow across it. And you know, and really kind of broke the mold. And
unsized canvas.
Unsized canvas.
And also, she married well. I remember asking Elaine de Kooning once, "What do you suggest women artists do?" And she said, "Marry well." And Helen always had a very, very strong idea of where she was going, and always married. Well, she was married to Motherwell, who you and I both love, and she's been married. Now she's married to a doctor who really takes care of her. So she knew exactly what she wanted, and I think most of us don't have that kind of discipline or dedication.
What's impressive to me about some of those people, like Rauschenberg and like Helen Frankenthaler, is that they're continuing to still put out really good work. I mean, that is a great inspiration to me. Less a function of the work that they're producing, but just the fact that they're out there actually still doing it and doing it at a very high level. There's something about that says, this is a good thing to do. It's a good. It gives you back as much as you give to it. You know?
One of my favorites of that period, although he was a little bit too flamboyant to be taken seriously, was Paul Jenkins.
Oh.
Did you ever know him?
I did. Actually, it was a Paul Jenkins show that got me painting in a non-objective style. I'd always liked the work, but I never actually attempted to do any. I always painted landscapes and still lifes and things, mostly for my own enjoyment. A friend of mine married him, and I went to this show that he was having in a real glitzy Upper East Side gallery in the late 70s, probably 1980 maybe, and you know, it was this great crowd, and here he was dressed in this fabulous black sharkskin suit, you know, his white hair, and just this great personality. The first time I'd met him, we went back to his studio afterwards, and you know, the whole thing was a lot of fun. But I was really taken with the paintings. I hadn't been that familiar with his work, and here were these pictures that were used huge quantities of acrylic paint. It was a kind of it was like a high wire act, you know, that he was moving around in one stroke, whole jars of paint. And yet he seemed to have great control over where all of this paint was going. And so I was very impressed. But I went back to the studio and I started to look around to see if I could get any clues as to how he was accomplishing some of this stuff. And I picked up a few ideas, but the ego in me said, you know what, you might be able to do something like this. So I went back home and I bought some paint and I tried to experiment. Never even came close. I think the biggest passage of paint that I ever did that was anything like his was maybe like that big. But it got me started. And what I soon realized was that I couldn't be Paul Jenkins.
Remember there was a movie about him, An Unmarried Woman.
Yeah, right. It was a
Jill
painting where they
Clayburgh, and I
used-
think Alan Bates played him.
Right, they used his studio and all his paintings, and I remember the scene where the one big painting was being taken out the window.
Right.
That was placed on Broadway. But you know, it got me going into abstract pictures, or non-objective pictures for the first time. But it took me about 2 years to actually make the first painting that I said, yeah, that actually looks like a painting. So it was a long process for me, and just learning how to do it. I had to go back to basics. I mean, I really went right back to life drawing classes, went out and painted landscapes with landscape painters who I knew in Pennsylvania, as a way to sort of get back to the basics. And one of the things I learned was that I was much more adept at actually painting the paintings, meaning using brushes, than moving big swaths of paint around with big knives and the kinds of things that he was doing, or even pouring it. None of that really worked for me. But when I got back to painting, that seemed to be where it was for me.
Well, how did you settle on abstract expressionism? A lot of people would consider that maybe old-fashioned, dated. And what is your idea when you do a painting? Are you trying to get the painting to move out? Are you trying to create a feeling like Jules Olitsky? What is it you're after?
Well, you make a good point about a lot of people do feel it's sort of old-fashioned. There is that, and there's a kind of resistance on the part of many people to even continue working in that path. But I think there's still stuff out there, and I like trying to see if I can find some of it. I do see other people who are finding it, and I'd like to be among some of those who are finding it. What I like to try to create in the paintings is a sort of a feeling of randomness. I don't want the paintings to look intentional, and in fact, when if there's a passage in the painting that has all the earmarks or hallmarks of, wow, this really looks great, this is cool, this is a really neat part of it, then I try to obliterate that part as quickly as I can. It's not easy to do because, you know, it appeals to me as much as I think it might appeal to somebody else. But I like to try to get rid of that because I want people to be drawn into just looking at the picture, being maybe somewhat mystified by it. You know, life is kind of mystifying in a way, and I want the paintings to sort of reflect that the universe isn't all, you can't figure it all out, you can't answer it.
Do you have somebody in mind, a critic, when you paint? A lot of people say, oh, Jasper Johns, because he's smart and also very facile.
No, I don't think in those terms, but I do think in terms of people whose work I like. Not that I'm trying to do an imitation of them, but I like to think about how it might stack up if it were in fact hanging in a show next to theirs. Would it be okay? You know, would it let? I'll tell you one. I had a show put in a painting put in a jury show one time that was judged by Clement Greenberg. That really felt good to me that he would have included my picture in a show that he juried. It was one of the few abstract pictures in that show as well. It was a survey of Pennsylvania paintings, and just to have him say, this is a good picture, put it in there. That felt good to me.
He used to, after he kind of retired from writing, he used to invite people to come to his house every Saturday, and they'd roll out the paintings, and then he would judge, and he would critique, and he would tell them what was good and what was bad about
really?
him. I called him up once. I read an article in Vogue about him, and I thought, my God, this would be an interesting person to meet. And I called him, and he invited me over, and it was a fascinating experience for a couple of years. I got to know the whole family. My husband and I were really included. And he had been a tie salesman when he started. So at the memorial, his wife gave ties to everyone.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, because he had collected ties. But he was a brilliant guy.
Yes, he was. That was a great honor for me. It was one of the things.
Well, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. How did you become in advertising a designer, or how did that happen, and what's the difference between that and fine art?
I mentioned a minute ago that I grew up in a blue-collar neighborhood. The men in my family would come home from work kind of looking pretty grubby and dirty, but there was one guy who didn't, and I asked my mother about what he did, and she said he's a commercial artist. He worked for the Philadelphia Inquirer. And I thought, I'd rather come home looking like him.
Really? And everybody else was coming from the mines, and people
well, not mines, but work, factories, factory work, or the oil refineries, and kinds of work where you get your hands dirty. And I thought that looks more appealing to me somehow. And since I had an interest in art, there was a vocational technical school right in my neighborhood, and I opted to go to that school and study commercial art.
Look here, excuse me for interrupting, but here's one of your paintings. Now with that's one of my favorites that you've done. Did you intend for it to be peeping through a hole, almost like a Renaissance painting, where you have a real epiphany?
Right. This is a little picture. I think it's only about 18 by 18, and it is acrylic with some elements of collage. And there's a lot of work underneath, and then this garish, sort of almost garish green color is laid on top, and then the green color, while it's still nice and wet, is moved off, and you get this peek in behind. And one of the things that happens with acrylic is it builds up a dimensionality, so you get these shadows, and you do get that feeling of looking behind something.
Now this is one of my favorites. Where did the green come from? That seems to be absolutely out of the picture.
Right, actually it came in fairly late. This painting was done at the end of a show. I was doing a whole bunch of paintings for a show. The last painting I did was that one. It's called Facts from Mars, and I called it Facts from Mars because it didn't look like all the other pictures. I tried to figure out what it looked like, and I thought, well, maybe that's what a fax from Mars might look like. It was what I liked about it was it set me off on a path of making a whole bunch of pictures that are, I call them messages from outer space, and using very prosaic, mundane terminology like PDFs, faxes, emails, but they come from Orion or Pleiades or Cassiopeia. FedEx from Cassiopeia is one of the titles. And just set off a whole series of paintings I'm still working on. And I don't intentionally start to do one, but they just kind of come by themselves. And if they fit in that category, then they go into that series.
Now, the people you grew up with, did they ever say you call that art?
Sometimes, yeah. Especially my grandchildren. But they seem to respect it at the same time because they've been around me watching it be made enough to know that it isn't automatic, But yeah, there are those. I mean, especially coming from the background that I came from. I was thinking about this before I came over here, and I think I'm the only person in my whole family, on both sides of my family, that has pursued a career in actually making art of any kind. The one side is, as I mentioned, a lot of blue-collar people, craftsmen, and the other side, my father's side, are scientists, academics, professors, one composer way back, but the rest of them are, but there are no visual artists.
Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah, so where does it come from?
But do you find there's a real difference between business people and artists?
Yeah, I mean, business people are driven by, I think they want to accomplish things, but they're driven by a sort of a different motivation. I think it is about accomplishment in the context of a very narrow business environment, whereas the artist, I think, sees himself as contributing to a sort of a bigger continuum, you know, going all the way back into history.
Well, I think artists are the poets of the future, and I think that you are the people who will be copied in years to come because you're offering something spiritually that the rest of us are seeking.
Yeah, art is a visual poetry. I always think of my paintings as being musical. They don't make any sound, of course, but I like, I'm so drawn to music that I think that shows in the paintings there's a kind of a reflection of musicality about them, where, you know, it's kind of popping up all over the place, and it's something I like to
Do you think that art, do you think painting can affect people, well, I guess in terms of war, in terms of violence? Do you think that we can have, Guernica, everybody says, has had a big influence on all of us, but do you think that art can really affect us?
That particular painting had a big influence on me in high school, because I saw it at a big Picasso retrospective at the Philadelphia Museum of Art then. But more to the point, I think the answer is definitely yes. The best example I can think of is the Maya Lin sculpture that was done for the memorial, for the Vietnam Memorial. About, I think it's 2002, I took my grandkids to Washington, and I took them to see that. And it was probably about a year.
Where is it? Right in front of the
It's on the mall. It's on the mall. And I remember standing there thinking that if the people who attacked this country on 9/11 the year before had stopped to see that memorial, they might have had second thoughts about what they did. It might sound like a fairly far out idea, but there are a lot of people who believe they attacked us because they thought we would not attack back, that we would run, because we had had a recent history of doing that. Well, when you stand there and look at that memorial, the thing that you realize is that this country gave up 50,000 lives in defense of its own beliefs. Not only were the 50,000 names there, but there were hundreds and hundreds of people who still go to that memorial every day. And I think if those terrorists had been standing on the side and watching that for an hour or so, they might have said, you know what, maybe you ought to think about this. These people don't run. And so I think, yes, it can have a very dramatic effect. And that memorial itself served to heal one of the great rifts and political rifts in this country.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, it had this feeling of a gash in the earth. And I think that it was controversial when it was created, but when people went there to see it, they suddenly realized on both sides, you know, what this really meant, what a great sacrifice had happened. And I think it allowed both sides of the issue to understand it from the other's point of view, that it wasn't just a mistake, it wasn't just war, you know, mongers creating the war, it wasn't just political, that there was a whole lot of other things attached to it. And I think it had a healing effect. I think it's continuing today. If you ever get a chance to see that memorial, it's just...
It's almost as if we have to come to some sort of surrender in order to get rid of what we're going through now.
Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure about that, but maybe.
You're also very involved with music. Tell me about that. You were just appointed something at St. Matthew's Church here in Los Angeles.
Right. President of the Music Guild. St. Matthew's has a chamber orchestra and a 8-concert series. I was involved in a similar organization back east, the Lehigh Valley Chamber Orchestra, you know, fully professional orchestras. And it was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. I'm not a musician, but I love music. And the idea that I could actually help get music played, live music played before an audience at a very high quality level, was a terrific experience for me, really rewarding. I love doing it. I love being around musicians, and of course I like sitting there and listening to the music.
So what do you do there? What do you do? Give orders? Do you? What do you do?
Well, the main job of a board, or in this case, just the music director and me, is to my job is to really help him to do what he wants to do. He's a very innovative programmer and a very good music director, Tom Neenan. The orchestra is entering its 21st year, so it's been at it for quite some time.
Fantastic.
So my job is to help him get done what he wants to do.
Yeah.
You know, that's really
What's
it.
a day like for you, a typical day?
Oh, I have a very nice life. You know.
Do you paint every day?
No, I don't. I paint on a rather leisurely basis most of the time, unless there's preparation for a show, and then you really have to get at it pretty intensely and keep out there and, you know, keep those paintings coming. And I like that, though. You know, one of the advantages of working in the advertising business is you got very deadline oriented and used to getting a lot of production done, and that's been very, very helpful to me as I've been making art, because I know how to buckle down and get to work, and that part's fairly easy for me.
George, Bill shows your work here in Los Angeles. Are you in any other cities? Do you have any other shows?
I have a gallery in Seattle, and
what's the name of that?
Bereshkina Gallery, and then one in Atlanta that I've just signed up with recently called Trinity Gallery. Very pleased to be with them. In fact, they just included my paintings in a show that they're doing with some of the real big name people, with Rauschenberg and
who else?
Chuck Close.
Wow.
And that. So it really feels good to be in that kind of company.
Who else?
Lichtenstein is in that, and a young painter from Santa Fe, younger. He's a little younger than I am.
Yeah.
His name is William Metcalf.
And doesn't his wife have a gallery in the Southwest?
His wife is Charlotte Jackson. She's been in the gallery business there for quite a long time. And the curious thing is that I bought a couple of paintings of William Metcalf's back in about 1987 in Santa Fe.
Never realizing. There certainly is serendipity spiritually. Yeah. In the last minute, what do you see yourself doing in the next 5 years?
Well, I'd like to continue on this path. I mean, it's really been fun. You know, it's very rewarding. I like being in the game of it. I like seeing the paintings out there. I like that the paintings get sent out to places where I don't exactly know where they are. I like that they have a life of their own. I'd like to just continue doing that.
Thank you, Glenn. This was really fun. I've really admired your work, and I'm so glad to finally meet you and get to talk to you in person. Art is not for everyone. It never has been. It never will be. But for those of you who love it like we do, we want to turn you on. I'm Molly Barnes. Thanks for watching.